The bright studio lights beamed down on JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, as he sat in the interview chair. The stage was perfectly set for what was supposed to be a routine interview. Another day, another journalist hoping to squeeze a controversial soundbite from a high-ranking politician. But this wasn't just any journalist. This was Martin Caldwell, a well-known media personality infamous for his aggressive questioning and his tendency to corner politicians into viral gotcha moments. Martin had built his career on tearing down public figures, often ridiculing them with clever wordplay and biting sarcasm. His fans adored him, his critics despised him, but one thing was certain: he had never been truly challenged. That was about to change. JD Vance, a best-selling author-turned-politician, had taken the political world by storm. His rise was anything but conventional, and his deep-rooted connection to America's working-class voters made him both a hero to many and a threat to the establishment. He had survived tougher battles, poverty, war, political upheavals, so a heated TV debate was hardly something that could shake him. Yet, as Martin Caldwell smirked across from him, the tension in the air was unmistakable. The audience in the studio and the millions watching from home could sense that this was going to be different. The program's producers had their fingers on the volume buttons, expecting interruptions, shouting matches, or maybe even a dramatic walkout. But what no one anticipated was how the interview would unfold, how JD Vance would completely dismantle Caldwell's arrogance with a calm yet brutal response that left the studio in stunned silence. As the cameras rolled, the theme music faded, and the interview began. Martin wasted no time going on the offensive. "Mr. Vice President," he began with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "you've often positioned yourself as a champion of the working class, a man of the people. But let's be real, aren't you just another privileged politician playing the part of the humble servant while enjoying the luxuries of power?" JD Vance didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. The pause was deliberate, calculated. Then he spoke. "Martin, I appreciate the question," he said, his voice measured, "but let's talk about privilege for a moment." There was something in his tone, an undercurrent of steel beneath the civility. The audience shifted in their seats. Caldwell raised an eyebrow, waiting for the answer, unaware that he had just walked into the first of many rhetorical traps JD Vance had set. JD Vance maintained his calm. His gaze locked onto Martin Caldwell, who still had that smirk plastered on his face. The studio audience was silent, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. "You brought up privilege," Vance continued, "and I think that's a conversation worth having. But before I answer your question, let's define what privilege really is." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Oh, this should be interesting," he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with condescension. Vance didn't react. Instead, he pressed forward. "You see, Martin, I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, in a family that struggled to keep the lights on. My mother battled addiction. My grandparents did everything they could to hold us together. And I spent most of my childhood wondering if I'd ever escape the cycle of poverty. Privilege? I didn't know what that looked like until I stepped foot in a world where people never had to worry about their next meal." Caldwell scoffed. "Come on, Mr. Vice President. That's a great campaign story, but let's be real. You're sitting here as the second most powerful man in the country. You've gone from rags to riches, and now you want to tell us that you're still just like the people?" A few chuckles echoed from the audience, but JD Vance remained unfazed. "I never said that, Martin," he replied smoothly. "What I'm saying is that privilege isn't about how much money you have today. It's about the road you had to take to get there. Some people are born into stability, connections, and a world that rewards them for simply existing. Others have to claw their way out of circumstances that were never in their control. And let's be honest, if I were the son of a senator instead of a struggling mother in a broken home, you wouldn't be questioning my rise. You'd be celebrating it." Caldwell's smirk flickered for a brief second, but he recovered quickly. "All right, fair enough. But you've used that story to position yourself as an outsider fighting against the elites, yet here you are, part of the system. You work for a government that makes policies that affect millions. Doesn't that make you exactly what you claim to fight against?" Vance tilted his head, considering the question. Then he gave a slight smile, one that signaled he was about to dismantle Caldwell's argument piece by piece. "That's an interesting perspective, Martin. But let's talk about you for a second." The audience murmured. Caldwell blinked, caught off guard. Me? He repeated, feigning amusement. Yes. Vance nodded. You sit in that chair night after night, lecturing the American people about morality, fairness, and justice. You criticize leaders, expose scandals, and demand accountability. But here's the thing. How often do you hold yourself to the same standards you impose on others? The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Caldwell shifted slightly in his seat, but he forced a grin. Oh, I see what you're doing, he said. You're trying to flip the script, avoid answering the tough questions. No, Martin, Vance said, his voice steady. I'm answering your question by pointing out a truth no one wants to talk about. Real privilege isn't just about money or power. It's about influence. And you, my friend, have more influence over public perception than most politicians ever will. The room went still. Even the studio crew, usually detached from the interviews, listened intently. Vance continued, you shape narratives. You decide which stories get airtime, which perspectives are amplified, and which are silenced. You can destroy reputations with a single segment, and you do it under the guise of informing the public. But here's the real question. When was the last time you looked in the mirror and asked yourself, am I holding myself accountable the way I demand others to be? Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had built his career by making others uncomfortable, yet now, for the first time, he found himself in the hot seat. The audience sat in stunned silence, waiting for what would happen next. Martin Caldwell shifted in his seat, his confident posture now slightly slouched. His carefully curated smugness wavered as JD Vance's words hung in the air like a thundercloud. The audience, the production crew, and millions of viewers at home could sense it. Caldwell was on the defensive, and Vance wasn't done. You see, Martin, Vance continued, his voice calm but firm, it's easy to sit in that chair and pretend to be the moral authority of the country. It's easy to cherry-pick facts, distort narratives, and attack people from a comfortable distance. But let's not forget, you're not just a journalist. You're a businessman. You make millions selling outrage. You create controversy because it boosts ratings. And yet, you lecture others about privilege and accountability? Tell me, does that seem honest to you? A murmur rippled through the audience. Caldwell's fingers twitched slightly as he reached for his pen, rolling it between his fingers, a nervous tick for someone who wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such scrutiny. That's a nice deflection, Mr. Vice President, Caldwell finally said, his voice a bit tighter than before. But let's get back to the real issue. Your administration claims to fight for the middle class, yet many of your policies have been criticized for favoring big business. So tell us, are you really for the working man? Or are you just another politician who says one thing and does another? It was a desperate pivot, and Vance saw it for what it was. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make Caldwell squirm. Then he leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the journalist. That's a great question, Vance said smoothly. But let's not pretend you actually care about the working class, Martin. The audience audibly gasped. Caldwell's jaw clenched. Vance continued, when was the last time you interviewed a coal miner? A truck driver? A factory worker? When was the last time you stepped foot into the kind of communities I grew up in? I'll tell you when, never. Because that doesn't fit the narrative, does it? You don't want to hear from the people who actually live through economic hardship. You want to hear from activists and analysts sitting in air-conditioned offices in Manhattan and D.C. telling you what the working class should believe. Caldwell opened his mouth, then shut it again. He was trapped, and he knew it. Vance pressed on, his voice unwavering. Let's be real, Martin. You and your colleagues don't speak for the working class. You speak about them. And you do it from a distance, in polished studios with zero understanding of what life is actually like for the people you claim to defend. The weight of Vance's words settled in the studio like a thick fog. Caldwell's usual quick-wit failed him. His reputation as the man who always had a clever retort was cracking under the pressure. Then, in a final blow, Vance leaned back and smiled slightly. So before you question whether I'm for the working man, maybe you should ask yourself, when was the last time you actually listened to one? Silence. The audience was frozen, caught between shock and admiration. Even the production team seemed hesitant to break the moment. Caldwell swallowed hard, gripping his pen a little tighter. For the first time in his career, Martin Caldwell had nothing to say. And JD Vance? He wasn't done yet. Martin Caldwell's face twitched as he struggled to regain control of the interview. He wasn't used to this. He had built a career tearing apart politicians, catching them in contradictions, making them squirm. But now he was the one squirming, and the millions watching at home could see it. The silence in the studio stretched, thick and heavy. Caldwell finally cleared his throat and forced a chuckle. trying to break the tension. "Well, Mr. Vice President," he said, feigning composure. "That was quite a speech, but you still haven't answered the question. Are you really for the working class? Or are you just another politician who says whatever he needs to say to stay in power?" JD Vance tilted his head slightly, as if he were a teacher watching a struggling student. "You know, Martin, I'll give you credit for one thing," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade wrapped in velvet. "You're persistent. But let's talk about power for a moment." Caldwell's smirk was gone. He was listening now, really listening, because something told him that Vance was about to drop the hammer. "You talk about power like it's something I hoard for myself," Vance continued, his tone steady. "But let's break that down. Power, real power, isn't just about holding office. It's about shaping culture. It's about controlling the conversation. And let's be honest, you and your friends in the media have more power than most politicians ever will." Caldwell scoffed. "Oh, come on. No, let's be honest," Vance interrupted, his voice rising just enough to assert dominance without shouting. "You decide what's news and what's not. You decide which stories get airtime and which ones get buried. You have the power to make or break people with a single headline, a single segment. And the best part? You do it all without ever being elected." Caldwell blinked, clearly not expecting that turn. Vance continued, relentless. "And when people like me push back, when we call out the media's hypocrisy, you don't debate us. You don't argue the facts. You smear us. You call us extremists, conspiracy theorists, threats to democracy. Why? Because you're afraid of losing control." Caldwell shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his pen. "That's nonsense," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "The media's job is to hold people in power accountable." Vance leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Caldwell's. "Then why don't you hold yourselves accountable?" The words hit like a gunshot. Caldwell's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The audience was dead silent. Even the camera crew seemed frozen in place. "You sit here pretending to be the voice of the people," Vance continued, "but when was the last time you actually talked to them? When was the last time you asked a single mother in Ohio what she thinks about rising grocery prices? When was the last time you visited a factory and asked a worker what it feels like to see his job shipped overseas? You don't, because their struggles don't fit your narrative." Caldwell opened his mouth, but Vance wasn't done. "You see, Martin, the real divide in this country isn't between left and right. It's between the powerful and the powerless. And the truth is, people like you, you're not on the side of the powerless. You just pretend to be." The words landed like a hammer blow. Caldwell's face was pale. He had walked into the interview expecting to make headlines at Vance's expense. Instead, he was being dismantled piece by piece in front of the entire nation. The silence stretched once more. Then Vance delivered the final blow. "You wanted a soundbite, Martin," he said, his voice smooth as steel. "Here's your soundbite. America is waking up. And they're tired of people like you telling them what to think." The studio was dead silent. Caldwell's face was unreadable, but the truth was clear to everyone watching. The vice president had won. And JD Vance? He hadn't just answered the question. He had ended the debate. For what felt like an eternity, the studio remained frozen in silence. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Martin Caldwell, once the lion of hard-hitting journalism, now sat in his chair, shoulders stiff, lips pressed into a thin line. The usual smugness was gone. The controlled arrogance had evaporated. Across from him, JD Vance sat relaxed, unfazed, and entirely in control. He had done what few politicians could. He had flipped the script, forcing the interviewer into the uncomfortable position of defending himself. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, remained still. The control room crew, usually robotic in their routine, watched in stunned silence, waiting for Caldwell's response. Finally, Caldwell inhaled sharply, gripping his pen as if it were a lifeline. He glanced at his notes, searching for something, anything that could help him regain control. But deep down he knew. He had lost. Still, he had to try. "Well, Mr. Vice President," Caldwell said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "You've certainly mastered the art of deflection. That was quite a performance." Vance let the words settle, then responded with a slight smirk. "It's not deflection when I answer your question with the truth, Martin. You just don't like the answer." The audience stirred. A few people even clapped, a rare moment in what was supposed to be a neutral setting. Caldwell's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to losing control of an interview, let alone having an audience side with the politician sitting across from him. Still, he pressed on. All right, he said, his voice slightly strained. You've made your point about the media. But let's bring this back to governance. You've built your brand on fighting for the working class, but many critics argue that your administration's policies, particularly tax cuts for businesses, favor the wealthy. How do you respond to those accusations? Vance nodded as if he had been expecting the question. That's a fair question, he said smoothly. And I'll answer it directly. He leaned forward slightly. The reason we push for tax cuts on businesses isn't because we're trying to help billionaires pad their bank accounts. It's because we understand basic economics. When businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, are taxed into the ground, they stop hiring. They stop expanding. They cut wages. And guess who suffers? Caldwell remained silent. The working class, Vance answered himself. The very people we claim to care about. He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. Now, I know it's easy to paint tax cuts as helping the rich, but tell that to the mom-and-pop shop struggling to stay afloat. Tell that to the factory owner who's trying to keep jobs in America instead of outsourcing them overseas. The real problem isn't businesses keeping more of their own money, it's a bloated government that spends trillions recklessly while pretending they're doing it for the people. A few people in the audience murmured in agreement. Caldwell noticed. His grip on his pen tightened. And let me ask you this, Martin, Vance said, tilting his head. When was the last time you questioned government waste with the same energy you used to question tax cuts? When was the last time you ran a segment on the billions lost in bureaucracy, corruption, and failed programs? Caldwell blinked. He knew where this was going. Vance gave a knowing smile. Exactly. The journalist swallowed, struggling to maintain his composure. His audience, his home turf, was slipping away. For the first time in his career, Martin Caldwell realized what it felt like